Your Majesty, Deputy Secretary General, Excellencies, Laureates, ladies and gentlemen, being the director of the World Water Week and Prizes, I have the great honor to welcome you to this year's symposium on the Stockholm Water Prize with the title Pollution or Prosperity. The symposium brings together laureates, experts and practitioners to explore a water-related issue that is dear to our laureate. This year, our esteemed guest will explore the opportunities and challenges for unlocking the water quality continuum. How can improved water quality be a driver of economic growth rather than its victim? And how can we bend the trend from pollution towards sustainable global prosperity? A special welcome to His Royal Highness for joining us this year again. We are forever grateful for your interest and your commitments and your participation. Thank you also to Deputy Secretary General. It is a great pleasure for us to welcome you here again, and thank you so much for your commitment to CW and the World Water Week. Last but not the least, welcome Professor Johan Rose, this year's Stockholm Water Prize laureate. I have enjoyed so much being with you this week and listening to your wisdom, and I look forward very much to this morning's session. Welcome also to the 2010 Stockholm Water Prize laureate, Dr. Rita Colwell, and other esteemed panelists. Thank you all for being here this morning. And I would now like to introduce a dear friend, former colleague, Ms. Cecilia Martensen, who is now the Secretary General of WaterAid in Sweden. And I know I leave in very safe hand for you to moderate this session. You have the stage, Cecilia.
Thank you, Karin. It's great to be back at the World Water Week every year in August. Your Majesty, Your Excellencies, dear colleagues and friends, dear Stockholm Water Prize laureates, because I know there are two that we're going to hear about today, but there are also more of you in the panel. Very welcome. As you all know, the Stockholm Water Prize was initiated in 1991 to celebrate and honor men, women, organizations, institutions who have made extraordinary water-related achievements contributing to the conservation and protection of water resources and to the well-being of our planet and its inhabitants. Over the year, Stockholm Water Prize laureates have represented a broad range of actors, of scientific disciplines, of organizations of different parts of the world. And my own organization, WaterAid, which I know also have a few representatives around the world, received the prize in 1995 for our outstanding work in ensuring and working together with partners to ensure that the world's poorest communities have access to safe water, sanitation and hygiene. We are so proud of this award still, it's 20-something years afterwards, that we found this year John Lane, who I know Your Majesty presented the award to in 1995, he was wearing his tie from the same year, even now, 20-something years afterwards. So this is how prestigious and how really proud we feel and the world feels of the person receiving, the organizations receiving this award. So very much welcome. So, well, enough about the past. We're here to talk about the present, but also to talk about the future. How can we ensure sustainable growth and through and with water quality? This year also, we're standing here and throughout this week, and especially tonight, we are celebrating the achievements of Professor Joan B. Rose as the 26th Stockholm Water Prize laureate. A big congratulations to you and for all your achievements. I'd like to just have a first round of applause. As Karin said, it has been really, really great to hear you speak and be part of the discussions over this year, and a really well-deserved recognition of your important work. So as Karin said, this Water Prize Symposium is where we try to bring together the laureates who have received the prize for different parts of water-related achievements, also with experts, decision-maker, thinkers, in order to explore the subject of this year's laureate. And one of the biggest risks to global growth and sustainable development is just that, the quantity and quality of our fresh water. Not just that we've seen by 2030, I've seen in many reports, the global demand for fresh water may outstrip the supply by as much as 40%. And unfortunately, we see that even in the present days, the quantity and the quality of water that we use are not enough for our human or economic development needs. And one of the biggest tragedy, and I must say statistics that always hits me in the heart, is the fact that 650 million people still lack access to safe water. 1.8 million people, so even people that have access to water, don't have it in a quality that's safe for them to drink. And this obviously causes enormous suffering. 900 million children die every day of diarrhea in 2016. It strains on healthcare system, it hurts our education and job opportunities, and keeps people in poverty and societies not flourishing in the way that they could. So just for a little formality and for you to know what's happening, I know otherwise it's been already 4 long days. This is the setup of the symposium today. We'll hear from 4 of our esteemed panelists before the coffee break. Then we'll have coffee for about half an hour. We'll come back and then we'll hear from the Deputy Secretary General, and we'll have a panel or a discussion. I don't like panels. Then it feels like people are sitting there talking to you. What we want here is a discussion. So the speakers will sit up here, but I also want you to be involved. So do please think about your questions, your examples, how we can have an interactive discussion after the coffee break with all of you. I know, Your Majesty, as well, the water quality and the quantity of water have been a problem in Öland this summer. So, and Öland and Gotland in some parts of Sweden. So we might also have some tips for you there. So, with no further ado, let me introduce this morning's first speaker. She has dedicated her professional life to water quality and public health safety, and is a leading world authority on water microbiology. She has been involved in numerous investigations on waterborne outbreaks worldwide. Please welcome on stage this year's Stockholm Water Prize laureate, Professor Joan B. Rose.
Thank you so much for the invitation. Thank you. Your Majesty, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, thank you so much for honoring me and inviting me here, not just for me personally, but for honoring water quality this year. As you know, we talk about water is a life, but water quality to me is health. So without further ado, let me talk about waterborne diseases. Here we have 2 iconic waterborne pathogens, cholera and typhoid. I chose 1993 to display on the map the cholera cases of disease, because that's when cholera, as Dr. Colwell knows very well, who did much of the investigation, came over to Central and South America and spread throughout that continent very, very rapidly. So it moves rapidly. But beyond that is typhoid. Typhoid is also a pathogen that we've had for many years, that we've known about, a very big problem in the Great Lakes before we started treating our water and treating our wastewater. We still have quite a bit of typhoid disease throughout the US, and it's now picking up antibiotic resistance. That top panel is a parasite, Cryptosporidium, emerged on the scene in the 90s, really, late 80s and 90s in humans. And it's spread throughout the world. It's a particular problem for AIDS patients and those with immunocompromised states. And so we can actually map some of the impact on those sensitive populations. And the last map there is rotavirus and deaths in children due to this particular virus. So throughout the world, in this day and age, we still are experiencing waterborne disease that we should be able to control. Now, there are hundreds of different pathogens that are in sewage that we need to think about controlling and using wastewater treatment as one of the barriers to safety. I work with 3 groups: the viruses, the little nano bioparticles. They're so small you can only see them under the electron microscope. I work with bacteria, a whole range, of course, typhoid, cholera, but there's salmon, there's E. coli 0157, Campylobacter. Many different types of bacteria are concerned with waterborne disease. And then, of course, the parasites, Giardia and Cryptosporidium. Now, we think of these as just causing severe diarrhea, but we now know that these agents cause many other illnesses. We'll get respiratory illness, there's chronic liver disease, there's heart infections, there's central nervous system infections. So the impact is quite significant. It's well beyond diarrhea. Now, I'm a big believer in developing water diagnostics, new diagnostics, but it doesn't mean that they all have to be high-tech. We do need low-tech systems that we can take out into remote settings. And I remember my student took these bag systems out into Nicaragua. She had a system where you didn't need an incubator. You were going kilometers between wells to sample in this community that was experiencing quite a bit of illness. She had her system on a donkey. One of the donkeys got away and it fell off, but this was fairly robust and only lost a couple of samples. So it's pretty good. You see, you can go out in areas and find which wells were contaminated, what should then the community do about it. We were also able to take samples and bring them back and use the high-tech methods in centralized laboratories, the high-tech methods where you could look at the DNA. Where was the contamination coming from? That's always the question we get. And with that DNA method, they could show that it was coming from cattle and not from humans. And so they could look at ways to keep the cattle away from the wells, and especially in rainfall events. So both low-tech and high-tech novel methodologies are needed. Now, I think I've worked in environmental virology and worked on human viruses, but with the new technologies, these metagenomic technologies, which come out of the development of systems to look at the human genome, we've been able to look very broadly at the types of viruses that are in water. This was a ballast water study, sampling ballast from ships that was picked up throughout the ocean, from Singapore and from Long Beach, clear across the world. We found 3 virus pathogens, one in shrimp, one in fish, and one in humans. And we could show that those Ds there were the diseases had shown up in humans. The H is where we found it in the harbor, and the B is where we found this virus in the ballast water. So these shrimp viruses, these fish viruses, and the human viruses are being spread through water and through ballast water. So it really opened my eyes really to what I'm calling the biohealth of the planet. And we need to think more broadly about diseases and the health of the planet. I do think that water security is at the core of sustainability. I think it's connected to food security and economic growth and the theme of this conference. And so the idea that all living things are affected by water quality, and we should be looking at that more broadly, thinking about that biohealth, because we are affecting the whole planet. And if we don't do that, how do we reach sustainability? So, and finally, I'd like to mention that I do think that education and cross-training is going to be necessary. This is people in my lab. We had a visiting PhD student from India, from Mumbai there, a student from Singapore, student from Kenya, a student from Iran, from Korea. These are young people that are all learning about water and water science. They're all going to go back to their own locales to build their own capacity, their own lab capacity, their diagnostics. learning to work in interdisciplinary groups. And so I'm a very big supporter of that effort into the future as we meet these challenges. So again, Your Majesty, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to speak to you and start off this interesting session.
Thank you, Professor Rose. Your presentation really highlights the need for all of us to take this seriously, the issue of water quality, and how it is a really global issue. I was stunned when you and I talked before the seminar, and I looked at the map, how really the diseases can spread and is spreading, and that we really need to take care and ensure our biohealth of the planet. Thank you very much. The next speaker is another Stockholm Water Prize laureate, this time from 2010. She, yes, it is another one, extraordinary woman. She has made exceptional contributions to control the spread of cholera, that also Professor Rose just talked about. Her interests are focused on global infectious diseases, water, and health. And she's now working, amongst other things, I'm quite sure, on how to ensure quality of recycled water for human consumption. So please welcome on stage Professor Rita Colwell.
Your Majesty, Excellency, honored guests, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honor to be back here at the Stockholm Water Prize Week, especially with my colleague Joan Rose. I have not been resting on my laurels since 2010. I've been working really hard on another really serious problem, which is how to deal with water shortage in California, Saudi Arabia, other parts of the world which lack water. We've addressed a very interesting problem of recycling wastewater. So a technique that we have developed is to use DNA tracing, much as you would see on television tracking criminals. In this case, we're tracking pathogens. We're extracting DNA from a sample, and then from that DNA, we sequence it. The sequencing is done in a way that provides us with DNA fragments. We match these with a very important curated library of pathogens that allows us then to identify all the bacteria, viruses, fungus, and parasites in a water sample, food sample, or even for that matter, a clinical sample. The identified bacteria then can be analyzed, the DNA, to determine the presence of antibiotic resistance, which is a serious problem globally, and other pathogenicity factors that are present on these microorganisms. So this allows us then to analyze water samples in a rapid 5 or 10 minutes using a handheld device that we are now in the process of developing so that we would be able to utilize wastewater. And in fact, in California and in Saudi Arabia, this is exactly what is now happening. That is, from the waste treatment plant, the water is transferred to the drinking water plant, and there a series of treatments, reverse osmosis, millipore filtration, chlorination, along with ozonation, provides then safe water. How safe is it? Well, the analysis that we've been able to do shows that the wastewater contains a lot of pathogens. Once it's gone through the millipore filter, it has only the bacteria that are essentially the water bacteria that are quite safe. And then after reverse osmosis, we find that the water bacteria are more dominant. And interestingly, we find that in the case of viruses, we're able to remove them almost completely from the water sample. We see here at the end of a full treatment that only very harmless bacteria remain in the water system, and the water, therefore, is available for drinking. So this technique follows on the discussion that Dr. Rose has provided. It's a very elegant way of tracking pathogens, proving that the water treatment system has been very effective and now can be reused. So we are now in a sustainable situation with full recycling of that very precious commodity water. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Colwell. As you said, we do have a great potential in reuse and of water, and we'll talk more about that and hear more about your experiences in Saudi Arabia and in California as we then come to the discussions. Next speaker was named the Technology Executive of the Year by the African Technology Awards a few years ago. He's currently the senior advisor to the president of the African Development Bank and has also served on several international intergovernmental scientific panels, among them the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change. So please welcome Professor Kevin Chua Urama on the stage to talk about how we can drive the green economy. Welcome.
Thank you. Your Majesty, Your Excellencies, laureates, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to be speaking today about this critical question about how can we grow without polluting water more or using more water. The convenient truth, we've heard from experts about water quality, all the problems we have, health problems and so on, but the truth is we're not using water very well at the moment, and how we treat water even in global dialogues, it's not as good as it should be. But the convenient truth is we can actually grow better. We can do better, grow better, increase our economies, and get more value from water without actually polluting it more. By decoupling, I mean the ability of economies to grow without polluting more or using more water. And there are several examples we have around the world on how this is already being done and can be scaled up. If we harness existing productivity opportunities, we could actually reduce we could meet up to 60% of the expected growth in water demand around the world by 2030. If we focus on agriculture, which is an area I have great passion for, and an area that uses up to 70% of water worldwide, we have huge opportunities for improving productivity, improving efficiencies in order to decouple how we use water and how we pollute water from agriculture. If we look at precipitation alone, over 80% of agricultural water use is covered by rainfall, what we get, green water. But we do not use it effectively. Only about 30% of that actually go into active use in growing our crops. If we also use deficit irrigation, we can actually offset the balance more in terms of augmenting where in semi-arid and arid areas and also in drier conditions, we can grow our crops more by harvesting the green water when we have it plenty. But what is happening currently in many countries, including in Africa, is that when we have plenty rainfall, we get floods that kill people. We get floods that move all these pathogens into drinking water systems and cause diseases. So can we manage that better and be able to grow better without polluting water more? The answer still remains yes, from all the evidence that we gather around the world. On this map, you see in the blue areas where we have huge potentials to grow crops more without actually irrigating. And in doing that, we'll not be flooding systems, creating antrophic environments that cause malaria in terms of growing mosquitoes and so on. On average, we see that globally, decoupling is already happening. The world is doing a lot better, but this is restricted to the United States, Europe, and a few developed countries. In developing countries, wastewater is still not being treated as well as we hear today, and we are not using water very well. In Nigeria, where I come from, we lose about 80% of water in the drinking water, in the municipal water systems, simply because of inefficient technologies. How about closing that gap? And we'll actually have increased our ability not to pollute water even more. But there are so many technologies out there now, some of which we heard of yesterday in the Young Water Prize competition, and a lot of which has been trialed everywhere. In agriculture, we have efficient rainwater management systems that we could use, very simple, cost-effective, can be done in households, can be done in municipalities, and yet increase how much we capture this green water for agriculture and for drinking in many cases. Irrigation delivery systems could increase agricultural productivity by up to 90%. We've seen that in Israel, we've seen that in the United States, we've seen that in many parts of the world. But why are we not scaling that up? Deficit irrigation is important, irrigation scheduling, drainage infrastructure management, and all those things that are listed there, including hydroponics. All these things are technologies that are already available, but we're not using them efficiently. In the municipal sector, we have a lot of opportunities for reducing just leakages from the water systems. Like I've mentioned, in Germany, we lose only about 5% of water in the municipal water systems. But in Africa, like in Nigeria, we lose up to 80%. That simply is not treating water as life, as we have heard in the morning, in the earlier presentations. We can also improve how efficiently we use water in our households, improve collection, treatment, and reuse of urban water systems, and also use disaggregated urban water supply infrastructure in order to make sure that we don't lose too much of water in the water supply systems and cause more water abstractions than we need for growing our economies. There are more new technologies, some of which we've also heard about, nanotechnologies and microbial fuel cells, membrane bioreactors, membrane technologies, and also source separation technologies that we can easily apply around the world in order to improve water in the domestic sector. And there are also simple and cost-effective water harvesting systems and technologies that we can use to capture the green water more and use it when there is need in the agricultural systems. These are examples from China and also from Ghana in Africa. We also have natural water purification systems like ecohydrology, using just green roofs, ecological treatments of water, just having pervious pavements instead of having hard pavements, as we have a lot in Stockholm, infiltration trenches and stormwater harvesting systems. All these can help us a lot to use natural systems to allow water to flow to where there is need and not create floods, and also not create pools of water that collect pathogens and transport them to our water systems that we drink. In conclusion, the answer to the question on whether we can grow sustainably, whether we can do more and do better and do good in the water sector is yes, we can. It is that simple. But yet, we're not doing enough. It's not happening enough. Why is it? We need proactive and active strategies and policy incentives that can make it happen at scale. We need institutional mindset reform. We need to consider water as a resource, as economic resource, instead of a social good or something that is given by nature. It just falls, and therefore it's abundant, because the truth actually is that the hydrosphere is not that abundant. Appropriate policies like water pricing, corporate water accounting and reporting are all very important, and also pollution taxes. How about making sure that those who introduce pathogens into the water systems are made to pay for it? The economic imperative is that they will not do that more. But that is not happening. Systems-level approaches also exist that we can use in many ways to improve our water systems. And institutional and social engineering, like the education that the Nobel laureate has talked about today, are also very important. In Africa, we don't have enough water engineers. We don't have enough people who understand the movement of pathogens in the water systems. We don't have enough people who can even do the assessments. And we don't have equipment and laboratories that even you can take your samples back to and analyze them. We need interventions in these areas to make it work better. And again, we can just apply regulation, what I call the 4R principles, just to refuse doing bad to water, to reuse water when it is possible, to recycle the water, and also to use treated water as much as we can. That is what I would call doing right by doing well. Doing well by doing right. Let us invest in sustainable technologies for decoupling in the water sector, because it is possible. It is happening in different countries, and it is scalable. We can scale it up and make it happen. I would like to propose, there was a symposium we had in the beginning of this session, and there were discussions of having a green water harvesting initiative for Africa. I think that is a very timely initiative because Africa holds 65% of arable land, and water demand in Africa water supply demand will outstrip supply in Africa by about 283% by 2030. Let's act together to solve this problem. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. Do stay. Kevin, Professor Rama, please do stay. I'm going to take this opportunity, now that we're actually before time. All the speakers, I must have been very strict in my instructions, because all the speakers have kept on time like clockwork. So thank you for that. But I'm going to take the opportunity then to ask a few questions, even though I know that you're dying for coffee, but you're going to have to wait a little longer. You say, I love that, yes, we can, and it's simple. So there are things that we can do, and you've got very, very, very tangible and doable examples here. In terms of positive examples, what do you see in Africa? Are there nations that are doing this? Are there communities that are driving this? What do you see as kind of the overhead scene of Africa?
Yeah, across the continent of Africa, we have a lot of initiatives now going on. The African Development Bank, from where I come from now, has launched what it calls its High Five initiatives. And that is how to actually manage resources better in order to do better in the agricultural sector. We try to see water in Africa not just as that thing in the cup or that thing in the river, but actually the thing that flows through the systems and makes life work throughout the systems. So in agriculture, there's been a lot of initiatives to improve agricultural systems, good agricultural practices, simply by using drought-resistant varieties and crops that don't use high water volumes to grow. That is a good way of helping to reduce the water demand in the agricultural sector. Also, simple technologies for irrigation being improved to do deficit irrigation, learning from examples that we have in the different countries I've mentioned, from Israel, from the United States, from this country, and many countries in Europe. It's also happening. It will be difficult for me to start naming countries, but in terms of water policies, South Africa stands way ahead in terms of trying to have water pricing policies that is actually graduated to ensure that the poor is also not suffering disproportionately. But there are great examples happening that gives hope, and the leadership of the African Development Bank in this area is also something that makes me, as a water economist, happy.
As a water economist, it's always good to have numbers and figures. I know I'm also an economist, so I can say that we love that, the spreadsheets, the numbers. So what is the cost for a society, for a nation, if you don't really take this seriously and if you don't act upon it?
We have different estimates from around the world, but in Africa, there are estimates that countries lose up to 10% of GDP because of water scarcity and water quality issues. And I have to say that those estimates are not really that robust, because all the diseases and the scalar effects, the multiplier effects of the impacts are not clearly known at the moment. And in different countries, you have different estimates that are coming out in terms of what that costs for us. But globally, ecosystem services from water is worth up to $7 trillion annually.
That's a lot of money, a lot of savings that can be done, a lot of things that can be done. Thank you so much. We'll hear more from you after the coffee break as well.
Thank you.
I think this is what I'm going to take with me. And I might also kind of give back to all of you, yes, we can. It is simple. So let's go out there and do it. And I think all of us here in this room work in different disciplines, work in different parts of the world, and we have the power to make change happen. On that note, we can, it's simple. I will introduce the next speaker. It was 2 years ago, the 15th of August 2014, when the Prime Minister Modi of India, on his speech to the nation, shocked the nation and the world by talking about sanitation. And not just talking about sanitation, but also launching a national initiative, the Swachh Bharat, the Clean India campaign, on that same day, which really has as a goal to get sanitation to all Indians by 2019 already. So next speaker will give us a little more insight on what's happening in India, how this is being implemented, and some of the challenges. Naina Lal Kidwai has previously served as the head of HSBC in India, and she's now driving as the chair of the Federation of Indian Chamber of Commerce and Industry's Water Mission and chair of the India Sanitation Coalition. So she's really driving that sanitation from the different partnerships and different ways to try to really put this into practice. So a banker turned sanitation activist. Naina, please, welcome you on stage.
Thank you. Your Majesty, the winners of the prize, and great researchers, all of you, ladies and gentlemen. It's indeed a privilege to be here today. I've come to this event now the last 3 years, and it has only grown my interest in the area and humbled me in terms of what we don't know, but also frustrated me in terms of sometimes how simple the solutions are, and yet how long we have to go to achieve what we need to achieve. So I'd like to begin with a fact, and that fact is that diarrheal disease, largely derived, as you've heard already today, from contaminated water and inadequate sanitation, accounts for 1,600 deaths daily in India. The same as if we had 200 people jumbo jets crash. And you know how much news a jumbo jet that crashes maybe once in the whole year gets. But we have this equivalent going down every day to diarrhea. It's the third leading cause of childhood mortality in India, and it's responsible for 13% of all deaths in children under 5 years of age. So this needs a solution. Now, the worst of it is that diarrhea is treatable and preventable. And it isn't just India. Globally, it's estimated that 2.5 billion people lack access to improved sanitation, which is more than 35% of the world's population. So India today is at a very interesting point in its history. It is absolutely the first time in our last years since independence that the Prime Minister used his Independence Day speech from the ramparts of the Red Fort to announce a program on sanitation and committed to sanitation. And therefore, not just the announcement, but the entire government, all departments, and indeed civil society, now increasingly the private sector and corporates, and the many bilaterals and multilateral and donor agencies that have engaged in various ways, are indeed coming together. And it is to help this coming together that some of us set up the India Sanitation Coalition, a platform to engage, to ensure collaboration. And it's very easy to say collaboration and partnership is something that should be. You'd be surprised how difficult it is when you get down to it, because the various partners, and I think events like this help because they bring us all together. But otherwise, you will, as we indeed had in India, 4 not-for-profits working in the same district in Bihar. One doesn't know what the other's doing. Each is reinventing the wheel. And then if you begin to look at the way the not-for-profit community engages with the private sector, or indeed with government, you begin to see that that dissonance can be quite destructive. So bringing it together is important. Documenting best practice or good practice is important, and that is what we have resolved to do, and indeed have already put up on a website which went live just actually last week. And the purpose of this is to bring everyone together so that 2 + 2 can equal 10. In doing that, and yes, as a banker, I should know how 2 + 2 equals 10. So in doing that, what we are creating is a platform for opportunity, for social entrepreneurs who want to work in the space to come forward and get funded, for projects to come forward so that corporates who are interested in funding but don't know how can find it. And it's as much about the for-profit activity in sanitation as it is for the not-for-profit activity, because we need both. We need a vibrant private sector that makes money providing equipment. We need social entrepreneurs and service providers at the grassroots who deliver products, and very simple products sometimes. In fact, it was right here at Seaweed 2 years ago that I learned of how there were 10 millionaires in Kampala who were millionaires from dealing in shit. So it's not such a shitty business. It works. Yeah? And it was such a simple model of people who were going in to homes, often homes in slums or in low-cost housing, and removing these cans which were provided all in a very scientific way, all about gloves, masks, color-coded, and would carry these cans away every day to a factory which treated this to fertilizer which was good enough to be used for cotton crop. And it is this virtuous solution that enabled what were basically handlers of shit to become millionaires in their own right. So it is these very simple solutions sometimes that can help us. We have our own examples right now in the slums of Bombay, where these women are indeed millionaires from doing a slightly different model than I've described, but they run the community toilets in the slum, and they have made that a business. So we need more of these solutions which are sustainable. We need to study what is working everywhere in the world, import it, adapt it, and make it work. And that's really what the purpose of the Sanitation Coalition is about. So India faces a huge sanitation challenge. About half the country still defecates in the open, and many households indeed don't have the technology for managing this in any appropriate way. And even worse, it begins to contaminate our water bodies, which are scarce, and groundwater, which is also a source of water. Over 130,000 tons of human waste is generated every day. Now, the problem, therefore, of water pollution is also rife. That about a third only of India's wastewater is actually treated, and the rest flows, and in fact, even the treated water flows into rivers, canals, groundwater, and this is quite apart from industrial waste, which also, of course, contributes to the effluent and issues therein. So India has tightened up considerably on its industrial effluent control. I do think we have a long way to go in the implementation. The regulations are there. But even as we look at this, the whole area of human waste also deserves a lot more action. So, as you heard, there is a renewed buzz in the country. And if we get it wrong over the next 2 to 3 years, if this government falls flat on its face, having stuck its neck out the way it has, I think we would have reversed a tremendous, tremendous moment in history when we could, in fact, have really moved the needle considerably on a very, very critical area. A critical area for India, a critical area for the world, because as you saw up there, these pathogens, these diseases travel, and they travel very quickly. The good news is that in a survey which was done just recently on 2 years of the Modi government in India, and citizens were asked, which of the government's plans do you like best? And the Swachh Bharat mission, which is the Clean India movement, was right up there. It has caught the interest and fascination of Indian citizens. We are the closest we will ever be to making this into a people's movement. We need a people's movement because this is not just about provision of toilets. And toilets are being provided in a huge way. Just over the last 2 years, we've seen over 30 million toilets built in the country. but it's all about the use, the maintenance, and the treatment as well. And for that, we need civil society, we need technology, we need innovation, we need people to respond and do the right thing. And that is why having this as a people's movement becomes very, very important. Now, to engage in this in terms of planning, clearly it's not enough to just bring people together. We need programs. There's a huge outreach happening by government for behavior change through media, but we also need to sensitize media. And this can sometimes be quite difficult because reporting on shit is no fun. We need media to come in there and understand the issues and to actually be able to very intelligently put out the messaging as we need it. The other aspect which is requiring attention is the technologies. We cannot just import the technologies of the West. Big pipes, big systems are very expensive, and it will take a long time before we can establish these large sewage clearing mechanisms as the Western world has got used to. The answer, and particularly getting it to some of the smaller hamlets, villages, even slums, requires distributed sewage facilities. And countries have done it. I believe Indonesia has over 17,000 of these. Even New York, I've learned by being here over the last 2 days in Long Island and places, has these distributed sewage facilities. They exist. They need to be documented. We need to ensure that we can learn from the mistakes, but bring the best of these technologies into countries such as ours, because the solution will lie in big systems and small systems working together. We've also used faith-based organizations a fair bit. In India, the whole area of cleaning of toilets tends to get buried into caste and is seen as a very low-income business. However, to change this outlook, enabling people to make money from the business, as I alluded to earlier, but also to change the perspective, can sometimes require very simple innovations. And what happened recently was some of our gurus sat with those that cleaned the toilets and at a very big holy event along the Ganges, and which is called the Kumbh Mela, in fact, and they ate together. The signal to India that this is not a job for others, this is a job for all of us. It is part of our religion to be clean and keep things clean. So sometimes these sort of what actually took a long time to get to, send very, very important messages. And faith-based organizations are playing a very key role in some of the mindset changes that are needing to happen. Now, we do, at the India Sanitation Coalition, come across multiple players with varied strengths, but there's never enough. We have many not-for-profits working in the space, but they need to be scaled up, doing more. We have much money already in the system, but we need more. We need more innovators. We need the social entrepreneurs who come with small solutions which can go a big way in the small hamlets and villages which populate India. We can learn from countries like Bangladesh, who have led in terms of CLTS, which is the community-led formats for total sanitation. And without communities, I don't believe we can go anywhere. Some of the best projects that have worked are those where you got a strong proponent from government, which was typically a grassroots government district collector or at that level, but the community embraced the cause, the community ensured accountability, the community understood why they were doing it, and unless the community signs up to be open defecation free, it's not going to happen. The opportunity. There's trillions of dollars going to be spent in building these systems. So the opportunity for big and small companies, for suppliers of goods and services is huge. And it is therefore, to my mind, a wake-up call for all of us, one which not just we in India participate in, but I hope we can bring all of you with your various strengths to work with us so that we can make a truly clean India. Thank you.
Thank you, Nina. I'll also take an opportunity.
Okay,
To
questions.
pose a few questions. And you're right, it has really made a dramatic change. Having half of my family in India, I've always been managed to talk water with my Indian relatives, but sanitation, as soon as I start talking, people shred away. But after 2014, all of a sudden, we had sanitation discussions over lunch.
Yes.
Which is that is what's needed, because people from all places of society needs to actually act and engage. But you are sitting as in driving Chamber of Commerce and industry. What is the private sector's reaction? Have they come in fast enough? Are they engaged? What do they want to do?
Yeah, so never fast enough. But it is actually, we house the India Sanitation Coalition in the Chamber of Commerce, who has come forward to provide us the infrastructure, so we don't have to spend the money which is being given us by the Gates Foundation and others on the infrastructure and on the finance and or audit costs, etc. But to actually get companies who for a long time have had their entire CSR initiative largely, and some of these budgets are quite big, are in education or in women empowerment, is really now about having them look at this space closely. And actually, sanitation sits in education too. We know that the girl child drops out of school maybe as 5 or 6 days a month if there isn't a separate toilet and facilities for her in school. It is absolutely part of education. It is absolutely a part of tourism. It's absolutely a part of whatever we do, health, because without sanitation, you can spend all the money you want in medicine, curing people, but why not prevent the diseases in the first place? So we're positioning sanitation as, no matter what you're doing as a corporate, this has to be an underpinning. And then, of course, the fact that the Prime Minister himself has made the call makes it a lot easier. The difficulty is that corporates don't know, the private sector doesn't know how to enter, because they aren't in the business of maintaining toilets. So we need service providers who can maintain toilets, ensure that there's quality there, come up with very interesting apps now where we have kids going around photographing toilets which are working, toilets that aren't. We're just developing a rating system, name and shame those that can't keep them clean, award those that can. So just there's great ideas that are just coming into us, which are important. Corporates are also now running some of the innovation programs. How do you encourage young people? How can you provide the infrastructure of venture capital and angel funding for the ideas that come in the space? So it's all very new. There's a lot bubbling out there. We need corporates for execution as well. In fact, there's a particular proposal which we're taking to many corporates, which was started by Unilever in India. And it's so simple. They just get the workers in their factory, 1 hour training, a mobile phone, which is the worker's own phone, and it's a 1-800 number with an app which they download. And they go into their village and communities, assemble groups of 20, 50 people, and play these wonderful stories aimed at children, aimed at mothers, aimed at men, and talk about the sanitation. So the one with kids is really quite sweet, because the little kids' sort of voices basically asking, hey, what makes Sonu so clever at school? How is it that he comes so bright every day and that he is first in class? And they follow him. And they follow him and they see he washes his hands, he goes to the toilet. So simple messaging, and it captures the fancy of the audience, and then they take a pledge as to how they will be part of it. So a people's movement, very simple little changes can be brought in through the corporate sector. So it's not just about the money, it's about volunteering as well, of people volunteering their time, and corporates are able to then award the person back, maybe even give some of their office time to some of these causes. So
really
we've got a long way to go, but it's, there are lots of little things that are becoming bigger things. Yeah.
I hear optimism, but also obviously big challenges ahead. Thank you,
thank
Nina.
you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
So it's good optimism, but also a challenge for all of us. I know many here work with partners in India or are working in India. It's also to be part of the conversations, to talk with new actors, to find innovative solutions for all of the different problems that also contribute to, of course, the decline of water quality. Before we go to coffee break, some of you were yesterday, or also throughout the week, might have seen the Stockholm Water Junior Prize finalists who have been displaying their work, their innovative approaches, their thinking around how they can contribute to different parts of water-related challenges. And yesterday was the big final where we had the one team awarded the Stockholm Junior Water Prize. And I would like to take the opportunity here to acknowledge them and to give them a round of applause for their excellent work. The winning team did an innovation, a natural innovative water retention device that mimics the water retention of the bromeliad plant. So using actually what nature does itself to find a technology who can do that. So please stand up, the team from Thailand. Big congratulations. Big congratulations. So we're hoping to see not just the three of you, but many of you from the Junior Water Prize up here as Stockholm Water Prize laureates in a few years. Thank you so much for this morning. We've managed to keep time. I know when you're in Sweden, keeping people from their coffee is one of the biggest mistakes that you can do. We will now take half an hour for coffee. And we'll come back into this room. We'll hear some more from the panelists, but also from the Deputy Secretary General. Now we'll let Your Majesty lead the way to coffee. So please all rise. Welcome back, Your Majesty, Water Prize laureates, Excellencies, colleagues and friends. I know there was the lateness with the coffee. I do apologize for that. I know how that can affect the stress level in the room. But I'm hoping everyone has got coffee. You're feeling energized and really ready to also have some important discussions and conversations with the people that we have here on stage that will trigger. But before we start the discussions, and also those of you who have social media, Twitter, do tweet, do use Facebook, get the word out. There are lots of people who could not be in this room. There are lots of people who couldn't be in Stockholm. So do get the word out, obviously. Thank you all for your panelists to sit here. You'll sit for a little while until we start the discussions. But before we start the discussions, I would like to introduce the last speaker to the podium. You were the first UN Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs. You've served as Sweden's foreign minister, president of the UN General Assembly, and you've held numerous of diplomatic positions and posts. But prior to his appointment as Deputy Secretary General, Mr. Jan Eliasson also served as the chair of WaterAid Sweden and my boss. So welcome up on stage, Mr. Jan Eliasson.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, Your Majesty, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, and great thanks to the panelists for starting this day off so interestingly, and also thanks to the organizers for this wonderful event, which is really a world-class event on water. I'm also very glad to meet Cecilia Martinsson, my own recruitment. I'm going to tell Ban Ki-moon when I get back to New York that I finally met a woman Secretary General. I want to start by raising this glass of tap water from this former schoolhouse and remind you that this, for you in Sweden, for us in Sweden, is a clear, safe, abundant resource, and that we have the privilege of having quality water from the tap. And I want to tell you, from having traveled the world and many of the trouble spots in the world, that this is an absolute luxury, an absolute dream for millions and millions of people around the world, while we take it for granted. And therefore, I think we should keep this in mind, that this is a challenge. This abundant resource, which isn't as abundant as we may believe, as we have heard this morning, is something that we have an obligation, a political, social, economic, moral obligation, to make this possible for all people in the world. And that is, in fact, now laid down in a document which was adopted in the UN in September, namely the new Sustainable Development Agenda, where we have now a specific goal, number 6, on water, that we have to achieve within the next 15 years. So it's a huge challenge that I hope that all of you accept. 4 years ago, the UN announced that the world had met its Millennium Development Goal target of bringing to half the proportion of people without sustainable access to improved sources of drinking water. This was, in fact, a great achievement. Many of the world's poorest and most vulnerable people now have better prospects of health and well-being. And this shows that when we set out specific and decide on specific targets and assemble effective partnerships, we can indeed reach significant results. But this class of clean water is still out of reach for 1.8 billion people in the world who drink contaminated water. Some 2.5 billion people, a third of the global population, live without adequate sanitation, toilets. We need urgent action to secure clean water for a safer and healthier world. Climate change, growing populations, and evolving lifestyles are placing ever-increasing pressures on scarce water supplies. Agriculture alone accounts for 70% of our water use. And the water that agriculture uses is not producing hydroenergy and is not used for industry, washing, drinking, or sanitation. Water is becoming an increasingly scarce and expensive resource, especially for the poor, the marginalized, and the vulnerable. In fact, you can, on the street or the slums of Africa, have to pay more for fresh water than you do in a city of Sweden. Much of the water is also seriously polluted. In the developing world, roughly 90% of sewage is discharged untreated into water bodies, lakes and rivers. And industrial activities release between 300 and 400 million tons of heavy metals, solvents, toxic and other waste into lakes and rivers each year. How we manage water has, as we all understand, serious implications for public health, food and energy, security, economic development, and even political stability in today's world. We have to make sure that water is a source of cooperation and not a source of conflict. Put simply, mismanaging water and sanitation is a threat to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, with negative effects on peace, development, and human rights. Reversely, managing it right brings great benefits in all aspects. The goal number 6 that I just mentioned aims to ensure by 2030 the availability and sustainable management of water and sanitation for all. One of the targets under this goal relates to the theme of this symposium. It calls on us to reduce pollution, eliminate dumping, minimize the release of hazardous chemicals and materials, as well as reduce the proportion of untreated wastewater and increase recycling. To achieve this goal, we must expand international cooperation and capacity building in support of developing countries. In particular, we must strengthen the participation of local communities. We have to see results in the field. I'm glad we have Dr. Rose's detectives around the world making sure that they act up. And we must mobilize finance and enhancing technology transfer on a larger scale. Efforts to prevent pollution will enable us to reduce costs, operate more economically, and minimize health risks. Investing in water and sanitation will translate into improved public health and food security, into poverty reduction and economic growth, into livable cities and energy for all, as well as into environmental protection and climate action. We, and I look around this room, you in this room, have the know-how, the innovative technologies and the skills to improve and preserve water quality. What is urgently needed is the will to decide on and implement worldwide programs for cleaner water. There is enough water to meet the world's growing needs, but we have to change how water is used, managed, and shared. Water is polluted and wastefully used by all sectors in all countries, often to a shocking extent, I must say. All sectors must work together for responsible and sustainable solution, whether it is governments, international organizations, parliaments, civil society, the business sector, the philanthropic and scientific community. Everybody has a role to play. I say nobody can do everything, but everybody can do something. The challenges are daunting. You may think your contribution is just a drop in the ocean, but as they say, every drop counts. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Just to follow up on that, one of your first initiatives as coming into post as Deputy Secretary General of the UN was to launch the End Open Defecation campaign. I think it was the first time, again, that sanitation and open defecation was mentioned on the 32nd, at least in the open, like that, in a campaign on the 32nd floor of the UN building. What made you do that, and what kind of results have you seen since then?
It's interesting, this advancement of diplomatic language. I think our Indian friend today has very clearly demonstrated that you have crossed the barrier. I thought we'd crossed the barrier when we brought about the word toilets in the public speeches, going on with open defecation and its implications, and as you said a while ago, now it's a lunch discussion topic, while it wasn't even talked about. This is important that you put it on the table, and it becomes a reality. But what was behind it was, of course, what I had seen to a degree which I found and find still absolutely shocking. To see what it means when you have a whole generation in many parts of the world growing up, probably in the end having a life as stunted human beings. You know, stunting is, stunted children, about 160 million or so, at least, maybe more, are doomed to a life with physical disabilities and also mentally problems that will mean that they don't live normal lives. So we, in fact, are not accepting everybody's equal value by not providing water to all. And I want to remind you all that water is a human right. The Human Rights Commission and General Assembly have confirmed that water is a human right. And it now, in today's world, relates both to security, fighting about water instead of cooperating, development, of course, obvious, and human rights. So I think sometimes you have to start from something very concrete, the micro level, or you will start from the macro level. After many years in diplomacy, I find it so satisfying to look at the micro level, the problem on the ground, and move to the consequences from that perspective, rather than moving from the perspective of rhetorics in speeches in New York, which isn't bad either, if you use the right words.
It's the balance of everything that's counting. Professor Rose, turning to you, as we clearly saw, and as you talked about, the waterborne diseases are a global problem, and I think it's talked about generally as a problem of the developed world, of poor communities. Why do you think it's not getting the global attention and the global solution? What do you think is needed to change this and to really tackle it?
Well, you know, we have these yardsticks that we judge safety by, and historically we use these outbreaks as our yardstick. And these are the plane crashes for the water industry or for any community. This is a big event. And so we have done, decreased outbreaks. We've decreased outbreaks certainly in the developed regions, but even in the developing regions, they've made a big effort. One of the things that struck me was that the only waterborne disease that is globally reportable is cholera. And that's the only one countries are required to report at the global level. So the typhoid outbreaks, some of the other outbreaks get reported at these local levels. And these big events are tragic situations in which we should have the moral obligation to pay attention to. And so they do, the outbreaks get the attention, but what we found, even in the United States, there's 19 million cases per year estimated of waterborne disease that goes under the radar screen. And this is because we still have exposure through recreational waters, fishing, and some of our groundwaters and small communities. And so unless we bring those statistics to the table for conversation, not just the outbreak, of course we want to take care of the plane crashes, but we need to change the tires, change the oil, we need to do all of those things. I've been a big supporter of a global database for some of these data, the statistics on hepatitis A, typhoid. These are very prominent waterborne agents. And I think they start to get more attention, especially in transboundary waters. We have a lot of transboundary waters. And I think that that could help quite a bit to bring attention to the situation.
Professor Colwell, you also worked a lot with cholera. Have you seen changes? Have you seen positive changes that will make us as a global community really come and drive forward?
I think one of the big problems is that we've spent a great deal of time with very imprecise detection techniques. And we really don't understand all of the disease agents that are transmitted by water. And I think this is why it's important, really, to develop new techniques, as Dr. Rose alluded to. And the approach that we've taken is to use DNA, which is a very powerful detection agent, and to be able to characterize everything that's in the water, all of the viruses, all of the bacteria, all of the fungus, and all of the parasites. And to do this at once within minutes, because then we can analyze and understand what's being transmitted by water. Many more diseases are transmitted than we are able to detect now by the crude techniques that we use, which are really sort of estimates of the total numbers of bacteria that are there. So I think when we understand that there are many, I think almost 25 or 26 diseases transmitted by the polluted water that unfortunately, as we've heard, many millions, in fact billions, I think, of people are forced to drink. So if we better understood the agents that are being transmitted and then focused on the techniques for removing them, and some of them are very simple and cost-effective techniques of solar radiation, filtration. We developed a very simple technique to help the villagers in Bangladesh to reduce cholera by simply filtering out the plankton and the particulates, and we could reduce cholera by 50% just by that simple technique. So I think that understanding what's transmitted by unsafe water in a very detailed way could be very effective.
And the technique that you were talking about, also looking at how we can reuse. I know that you're testing in Saudi Arabia and in California. We're talking about innovative approaches, small scale, big scale, low cost, high cost.
Yes.
Is that a technique that can be utilized for ensuring that the recycled water is safe, or is that?
Absolutely. I think on the largest scale, it's a matter of understanding what's happening with each step of the treatment process. And we've been able to show that, in fact, it's quite effective. And you can remove the viruses by the treatment that's being used, which is reassuring, which means that the tap water that we're drinking is, in fact, safe. But it also can be modularized and can be developed. In fact, there's a unit, the Safe Water Network, located in New York, develops kiosks that can be established in small communities, and by that technique you can create in a very small scale, and then if you have many of them you can expand the scale you can scale it up so that many more people can benefit from it. So yes, the DNA detection technique, we're working on a handheld device. That means you can simply take a water sample and extract the DNA within this device, and with enough information on chips on the handheld device, make a diagnosis, and if that's insufficient, you can send it by cell phone. I think there are more cell phones than people in the world. So
there are more cell phones than toilets. That's the statistics that I know.
Unfortunately.
That's correct.
Now you see what I'm passionate about. Toilets. Well, I think many of you have really talked about prevention and cure. And I think for me, a staggering report that came out last year from the WHO and UNICEF, they were really showing that 38% of health clinics in low-income and middle-income countries lacked access to safe water, where we spend billions and billions of money in cure, but we're not really dealing with the prevention. What is needed for this mind shift of the world of the investments in really making sure that we do look at the prevention side of things? Maybe Kevin, from your side, because I know in Africa, many of those countries were in Africa in this report, for example.
Yeah, I think the main issue comes down to policies and regulation. If we might understand pathogens as much as we can, water flows and how the pathogen moves within the water systems, but it takes the human beings to take action in order to stop polluting the water, and or to even use water less so that you have enough volumes in the water flows in order to neutralize some of these effects as much as possible. So speaking from the perspective of an environmental economist, I would talk about a polluter pays principle. If we try to make sure that now that we have good technologies that can easily tell and trail where the pollution is coming from, then if we follow through to get the source of the pollution, feel the economic impact of absorbing or internalizing that externality, because then it will be easier to change behaviors so that people are no longer polluting the water. Sometimes it's done unconsciously. We don't know that the cattle by the river systems is polluting the water. Now we know what do we need to do in order to make sure that the owners of the cattle will actually give water its safe haven to ensure that the effluence does not get into the water systems fast. So that is one in terms of quality. In terms of quantity, then fiscal policies become very important in terms of how do we price water. In agriculture, a lot of countries, the water is just at a zero price. So you flood the rivers, you abstract from the rivers and flood your farms as much as you can. You water your gardens as much as you can because it's a free good. And any free good attracts, is used carelessly because there is no impact on the utility of the people who are actually using it. So two sides of the coin in terms of pricing water to change human behavior towards water, and also pollution taxes to ensure that polluting the water will be reduced, will be very clear ways of trying to address the problem from that economic perspective. In Africa, in countries where there's still not good understanding of how water quality is a problem, even though it is a problem, it's a daily problem, But understanding and making the linkages with what we do and how that caused the problem is still not there. Then water education becomes, water literacy becomes a very key issue. In this conference, there's been a term used about water blindness. So that water blindness becomes a major problem because we don't really know what we're doing and we don't understand the implications. And on a global level, I would like to appeal that even in conferences like this, we should actually not forget the economics of the issues. Because without understanding the economic implications, I mean, examples and empirical evidence around the world is that we as human beings, we think in that utility maximization principle. So if that does not feed through into that system, then we will not be able to change it in a more systematic way. So these issues of water quality and water quantity, the water scarcity issues, should become mainstream in policy discussions in countries, policy discussions at a global scale, so that we'll be able to understand the linkages and the interlinkages of water and how it fits even into the GDP of countries, into your pocket as an individual, and how you manage your personal finances. If we get that true, it is a lot easier then to utilize the wealth of knowledge and experience that already exists in water science to manage that resource better. I think that linkage is what is still missing.
So from a global level, then at the UN level, what can be done and how can we really make sure that we do put more emphasis on prevention than cure? And can the new global sustainable development goal help us in that quest?
I think they can, and I think it's very good that you put the finger on the prevention aspects. If you look at our humanitarian programs we have now, they are almost reaching the level of $25 billion a year. The needs, we have approximately half the money to do the job. But they are growing almost exponentially because we do not do prevention. We need to really have a massive movement in the direction of prevention. That goes for conflict resolution. It goes for this area. If we saw the value of well-functioning water infrastructure, what that would mean economically, socially, politically, it would be an enormous difference. And again, if we are to live up to our human rights obligations, we should really have a massive move in the direction of prevention. I feel, like running from one crisis to another across a minefield of humanitarian crisis, peacekeeping operations, and all in the uniting factor of frustration is the lack of prevention. I don't know why we don't realize that we need to see the early signs of what can go wrong. Because we pay an enormous price in terms of human life, money, our night's sleep, possibly, and the reputation of international organizations and institutions, also nationally. So I really, if there is one word I want everybody to remember here, is prevention, practical prevention. We are, for instance, now starting a program of trying to discover human rights violations early on and act on that stage rather than wait for the mass atrocities. You can translate that to every other area like water and sanitation.
In India, I guess, did the society see it coming, the Swachh Bharat, the Clean India campaign? Because I guess that's for me is one way of really dealing with prevention. Yeah. Maybe a few decades too late. But was this a discussion that had been happening beforehand? So this was seen coming, and is this something that really people look at as a preventive?
So I think it's so in your face that you can't ignore it. But the issue really is, what can I do about it? And what should my response be? And I think that was what was lacking. What is it that I need to do and can do to achieve what I think needs to be achieved? And young people play a very key role in this. It's through schools, it's colleges. The response is enormous. The ability has to lie in us to organize this energy in a way that works. So at some levels, in some villages now, they have a gang which goes around and blows a whistle every time they find typically a man, peeing against the wall. So it can be very simple little techniques which sort of remind people, hey, you're not doing the right thing. And in fact, as this change begins to come in terms of thinking, and everybody understands they can have a role to play, it begins to change. I'm a firm believer in the fact that to be enduring, we need community activity. And I'll give you an example of a big town called Moradabad, a very big town by any European standards, which in fact is a big exporter of brassware and metal goods around the world. And the water there had begun to be laced with all kinds of metals. It was so critical for the community to recognize it, because these were lots of small manufacturers, and they were the fathers of the kids who were drinking all this water. So to make the community realize that they were polluting, to make the community come together to effect change, because all these little units, if they shut down, people are going to be without jobs. So that wasn't the answer, that these units did their own effluent control. What it needed was a very strong government functionary there. It always needs one good person, and this guy was amazing. The district collector, citizen action, it needed an NGO, in this case it was WWF, it needed corporates, so I was at HSBC at the time, so it needed some of the funding and support therein, and that's the kind of collaboration that worked, and Moradabad cleaned up. It so happened it was the same metal-laced water that was going into our rivers as well. So that's the change. And it endures because the district collector moves, but the community carries it forward. But it was a huge activity around education, organizing, the citizen committee that runs it going forward. So I think that's where the organizing part has to happen. And we can't expect individual citizens to organize, but somebody who else puts it together gives the model that works. I just, it's very struck by the whole discussion on prevention. And I think we're just organized wrongly in governments. If you look at the health budget of a government and the water budget, the water for drinking water budgets, there's a huge differential. And if in fact, if we looked at bundling it together, and instead of spending all that money on medicine, actually spent it on the prevention piece, it would be a very different story. But we don't look at it that way. These silos have been created. You can never be seen as cutting back your health budget because that would be politically wrong, but then you don't have the money to increase your water budget, and so you're stuck. And if you look at the way insurance companies work, it's the same. They don't pay up for prevention, but they will pay for the cure. So we are just organized wrong, and we have to change this.
Could I amplify on that?
Absolutely.
Because I think one of the problems with balancing, for example, expenditure on vaccines and expenditure on safe water, that it's not understood, really, how many different kinds of pathogens, parasites, bacteria, viruses, are transmitted by water. So if it was understood clearly that by the fact that we in the Western societies benefit from having delivered to our homes safe water, and we are protected, we're prevented from getting 25 different diseases. And I don't think the effectiveness is really understood. And so, for example, of the waterborne diseases, we have only 2 vaccines. One against rotavirus, which is very expensive and requires two inoculations, and the other is cholera, which is maybe 60 or 70% effective. That's it. But there are a whole lot of other pathogens that are transmitted. So by providing safe water, you do a huge public health benefit in one go.
And I mean, public health was always about prevention. At the turn of the century, of course, we had a big movement towards community. Public health is community and prevention. But then, the shift in research even around how do you get at good public health policies, I agree. I think you need policies, and I think you need that leadership to go towards prevention strategies. Because once you've prevented something, everybody's like, okay, it's fine, and it goes to the back burner. And there's so many things that people are worried about. And so I think that we need those types of policies, we need those types of comments, investments back into public health and even into the science of public health. It's, I just saw some very interesting research in which they found that people that were sick, they took on activities that they knew weren't right, but they thought they could just get away with them for a short amount of time because they didn't feel well. So in hygiene or just individual things or unsustainable practices, and they knew that wasn't quite right. And this was a study that was self-reporting. They self-reported. They said, when I'm sick, I do this, and I know it's not right, but it's only for a few days. But then when you have, 1 billion people sick, and they're all, for a few days, undertaking these practices, then how do we break that cycle at some point? So we need a massive, I think, mind shift again back to, where we were in the, the turn of the 19th century, where we had this large movement towards community health and public health.
Yeah, I think this is a very important aspect in terms of if we really want to achieve prevention, we need a mindset shift in how we do policies. Currently, if you want to discuss water and water quality and water issues, you go to water ministries. And then water ministries, sometimes attached to environment ministries, are always not the prioritized ministries in countries, in many countries, if we face the fact. Now, but then where is the resource going to come from? It's from the finance ministry. So in having those discussions, we actually need to make sure that water becomes the connector that it is, that brings the ministries together. Because water impacts on health, water impacts on agriculture, water impacts on education. If you're from Africa, like myself, I used to go to school with jerrycans to go and fetch water. So that after school, I go to fetch water before I go back home. And that certainly will affect my performance in terms of time to do my assignments and so on. For girls, most of them drop out of school because they just can't cope in doing all those together. And sometimes the burden of doing that in homes are laid on girls. So we have many girls who are not going to school. So education minister should be concerned about water. The finance minister should be concerned about water, especially if you see, like in Africa, that it takes up to 10% of GDP annually. So the fact is that we are not really putting water in the center place that it is in our lives and in our policies that we make. And for us to be able to do prevention well, we need to make sure that we have all these people on the table. We have the finance ministers, we have the environment ministers, of course, the health ministers, and so on, to understand what really it means for them in economic terms when we have poor quality water or when we lack water for agriculture and for all these other things. And this is why I go back to doing the economic analysis of this. I draw from our experience in climate change until we begin to come up with costs, the cost of climate change, the economics of climate change. A lot of people were arguing, it's just something for the scientists. The scientists say. But then when you begin to see that this is really on the bottom line, companies will get interested, corporates will get interested, communities will rise up to act about it. So it's more like singing for economics, but I think that is very, very important. I recall when we were doing the benchmark models for the Water Framework Directive in Europe, I used to tell them when we meet, I say, don't forget the economics, because I used to be the only economist amongst hydrologists. I was struggling to understand the models and all the beautiful flow models and so on, and try to fix what does this mean for GDP? What does it mean for the finance minister and so on? We need to invest a lot more on that, because that will bring the dialogue to the table, and then action can be taken. The budgets can be released for that, and then policies can be shaped to make sure that water polluters pay for it, and then when you waste water flooding your gardens, you know that you're pouring dollars on the grass, when sometimes the grass doesn't need it at that time.
Yeah. So a mind shift in how we do policies and how we see the water in the ministry. So if there are any ministers out here or government officials, you know what to do when you get home. I'll let the audience in the room also come in. So if you do have, I'll take 2 or 3 questions and we'll let the panel answer or comments. We are having a mic running around, so if there are any questions. There is one down there. I saw one hand over here as well. Came down.
Hello. So, yeah, I've been thinking about one question, and I guess I have already discussed with my colleague. So, yeah, I might be somewhere wrong, so please correct me if I am. Well, one of the main sources of water pollution nowadays are factories all around the world. And as we all know, that all factories are actually imposed to quotas. Quotas, well, some restrictions, how many pollution can this or that factory actually exhaust to the environment. And we all know that to some factories those limits are bigger, and to some factories their limits are less. Well, the thing is that nowadays some bigger factories can actually buy quotes from smaller factories. And, well, nothing changes actually. So big factories continue to exhaust more and respectively to pollute the environment more. And when it comes to an age, is the government or maybe the UN, or I'm not really good at this, maybe some other organizations, will they be ready to impose some stricter limits, some limits which are more strict, or some regulations that will be quite extreme, but which will really stop the factories to pollute everything? Thank you.
Thank you. I'll take another question. I saw there was one hand who came down. There's one here, gentleman in front.
Good morning, Your Majesty, Your Excellencies, and distinguished panel. My name is Rudy Roberts. I'm from South Africa. I'm an emerging water entrepreneur and industrialist. Like many bankers, I gave up my job to develop a water business in South Africa. I wish I could tell you the story. It's quite fascinating. But to cut a long story short, I think that the panel's discussion on water is very significant, and I think my doctor, the colleague from Africa, makes a very pertinent point, which I'd like to reemphasize. It might seem redundant, but it's quite important that the approach that the world should take is this integrated approach where water is pertinent, not a technical issue, and a consequence of developing a country or its industry or civilization. Until that policy shifts right into the ingredients, as you say, the output to GDP and the relationship to GDP. I'm educated today by the distinguished doctors and scientists. It enhances my thinking, and the economic planning in regard to that is very, very critical. For us, for example, in South Africa, I think we are understanding that water has to be part of our national development plan. We've done some very good things in water, for example, in human rights. We exercise the human rights of giving 30 liters of water away. There's a contention about that. But I think the fundamental point that the professor has made is that this integrated approach is important. Why is it important? Yesterday afternoon, I was in an investment seminar. And the investment bankers, like myself formerly, don't get it, that there has to be a transformative manner to water. And Thomas Piketty describes the inequality of this world. So there must be some transformative capital or way of compelling corporates, entities, capital to shift his ideas that we have to invest in water, because the outcome and consequence of that is far greater in food, in retail, in mining, etc. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So go back to the question about pollution and factories and industries and quotas. I know Nina and also Kevin. Nina, would you want to go first?
Yeah, it's a great question. There is no doubt that over time and history, factories have been big polluters. The good news is that today most countries have very strict laws about this. The bad news is that many countries have very poor implementation of these laws. And in many countries, you can bribe your way through the problem. So implementation is going to be key. Communities around factories are beginning to play a very key role. And in fact, at a couple of World Economic Forum events ago, there's a significant study which gets done. And water risk has been identified as one of the biggest risks by the companies that attend the event. So shortage of water, usage of water, pollution, effluence, all of that right up there in terms of the way industry is engaging with water. When I look at India specifically, our large companies are by and large compliant. because there's reputational issues. They have the money to invest, to do the right thing. But 60% of India's industry and employment is in the small scale industry. And that becomes an issue because they either don't have the money or the ability to comply. And some of the laws that have been set, there's a very strict law right now called ZLD, Zero Liquid Discharge, which is at a level which is so high that they don't even want to start on the journey because they know they can't achieve it. So I can only say where policy is set, it shouldn't be altruistic right up there, it should be realistic. It should set the journey for the companies in a way that they can improve over time. But there are solutions, and there are companies that make a business out of providing solutions. So it's really just a case of making the economics work. The other tragedy, and I fear that big business, so multinationals, can play a very big role in the way they buy, because they're often the ones that buy from the small companies. But they want the small company to certify that they're doing the right thing, but they don't want to share the cost. So what has happened here is that these small companies that know what they have to do, they have to now produce what they're producing at a higher cost, but they're not going to get a higher price from their buyer, who's saying, yes, I want you to do this, but that's your problem. So it doesn't solve. So we need the supply chain to be far more considerate than it is. The certification that we as consumers ask for plays a very big role. And I would live for the day when I should know that the jeans I buy, it requires 40 liters of water. The sugar I buy has used 60 liters of water. And if I begin to know the water content, the same way as I know the protein and carbohydrate and whatever stuff we get in our food thing, let's get the water content too so we know what we're doing about destroying the water environment.
I would add also that many of those companies are discharging dollars by having inefficient processes and not recovering from the waste. They are losing money. And I don't think that's made very clear. And again, it comes back to a good economic argument.
Yeah, just adding from where we've done a study, a global study on actually water decoupling in the industrial sector. And we find exactly what you're saying, that countries could actually improve profit a lot by improving water efficiency in their factories. And also the same, a lot of the things that are considered effluents that are poured into the rivers are actually secondary resources that could lead to other economic products. But people don't know this. Companies don't know this. I have to produce jeans, so that's what I'm there to do in Lesotho, and then just once I get out that jeans, every other thing becomes waste, and then the easiest way to do it is to pour it into the rivers. And the second point there is about, we might talk about laws and regulation and every other thing, but we need to think about also poverty. Because the reason why companies buy their way, whether it's in the oil sector in Nigeria or in the water sector or anywhere, is because the community will prefer $1 today than $2 tomorrow. And this is a classical issue about high discount rates of the poor. Because the future is uncertain and survival today is the major issue. They don't really care about integrity or about sustainability for the future. So in terms of trying to make sure that the quality of life of the people around the factories are also improved is a very long-term way of trying to solve the problem. But there are 4 basic principles, actually, that we came up with in the water decoupling report. The one I call the 4 R's: refuse, reduce, reuse, and recycle. If we try to sell these principles to countries and municipalities, there are simply some companies that we should not allow to be built in particular places where they are, in the riparian zones and where they are close to the rivers and so on, if we actually know clearly the implications that it will be in future. And in that way, you have refused something that actually creates economic rents and benefits for you. But then where you need to, you reduce the amount of water that flows through that company in itself, the amount of effluents will become also reduced because you are using water more efficiently within the company. Then teach companies to reuse the water they produce because they are also going to be useful in terms of improving the economic rent. And also water recycling, water treatment plants, and so on. can come into that. If only we can use the good science and put the economics behind it, corporates will learn that they are losing money when they pour water, effluents into the river systems. Because the same water that is polluted is what they're also going to get back as inputs into the system. And then the quality of water affects what they do. And if you think about most products, the water embedded in products is very high. That's the point you've been making. When you take a bottle of Coke, you have so many cubic meters of centimeters of water that has gone into the production, with the cloth we wear and so on. That knowledge of embedded water in systems needs to become clearer so that people will understand how water is central and how we treat water affects the bottom line, whether it's for the municipality or the company.
And I do think that if we have an initiative, a global initiative around resource recovery, we're just starting, that conversation starting to happen in water. The same way we started talking about renewable energy and what do we need to do, what are a whole variety of ways we can get resource recovery, because it's not going to be one size fits all. And our old policies in which we thought we could use the hydrodynamics of the region to create, so much effluent can go in, and then we can do these trade-offs with one company and another. That doesn't work very well for water and downstream pollution issues. So it has to go back to this sort of global idea of resource recovery as an initiative. So, and just to add on, in our discussion about water curriculum, the need for business and economic education as part of that water curriculum has been at the forefront. So we definitely agree with that.
Well, I'm glad this discussion leads us to some fundamental conclusions. So we have already, I think, reached consensus on the importance of prevention. I think we need to find similar consensus on always making more long-term analysis, not the quarterly result or the yearly budget. And the last one is to go horizontal, not vertical. Here are some very basic things how we organize ourselves, whether it is in the United Nations, European Union, or governments, or local communities. You've got to make sure that you have a preventive approach, that you have an approach of long-term analysis and work horizontally. Make sure that you see the totality of the picture. I was planning last year a trip to Asia to prepare the ground for the Sustainable Development Goals. I came to Asia. There was one Minister of Finance who was absolutely in charge of all the SDGs. So I asked him, why are you so knowledgeable on all the SDGs? Because he could speak about energy, agriculture, everything. It turns out, he said, I'm not only Minister of Finance, I am Minister of Strategic Planning. In other words, he had to look not only at the budget-cutting job of a finance minister, as we all know, but he had to also see, is this a cost or investment? Yeah. What will be the long-term effect? Right. So that's a very modest suggestion of organizing governments around the world. But then on water, I can tell you, when we, after my time in WaterAid, I was MDG advocate for water before I took on this job. We made an analysis of the effects of doing water and sanitation right on the other, at that time, 8 goals. You remember the MDGs? And it turns out it has an enormous effect on child mortality, maternal health, education, gender equality, and poverty reduction. In other words, it goes across and has an effect on 5 other goals. And that type of analysis is not being made because we are cursed by this silo approach. So here are some very fundamental messages from not only this panel, but from this meeting, to move on these issues of prevention and of horizontal approach and the third aspect that we talked about.
I just want to come in on another area, and that is basically the shortage of expertise in areas to do with sanitation, for example, which is just not seen as a sexy enough business. So all our young technologists are moving much more into electronics and computer engineering than we need in this space. But we've got to move that needle and make this energy, the effort that we put into areas like energy efficiency, sanitation, water treatment, back where it belongs, because these are, as we're discussing today, the key issues for the future.
I think we saw many of that yesterday at the Stockholm Junior Water Prize. So there is
Yes,
hope.
many of them here. So you're in the right space.
Thank you.
Really great. More questions from the floor? We have one there.
Thank you for your presentations. My name is Samir Safai. I'm a sustainability consultant based in the Netherlands. I'm very curious about why, I mean, we've now following up on the water footprint of different products and how this is, or virtual water embedded into products. Why don't we see water footprint being taken into trade policy? Because we talk about consumption, and I'm a big proponent of sustainable production and consumption. You can have all the technology you want. You can have all the right regulations in place. But if your basic human demand is so, let's say, moving towards meat production, and this is the big one where we also talk about constantly, and we need to reduce our consumption significantly. I really like India for this reason, that no matter how much wealth we gain, we're still mostly vegetarian. But I can't expect the whole world to do this, but still, just those small changes in human behavior have tremendous impacts on the entire supply chain, on the entire production cycle. So I would like to see a bit more sense or sensibility applied into our trade policy, because if we're using Amazon rainforest felled for soy production for export to European burgers, I mean, this doesn't really make much sense from any sustainable point of view, perhaps economically, but this is because things are not priced correctly. So if we talk about valuation of water and the pricing, correct pricing, if you can internalize those costs, as our colleague just said, then you could have the proper economic model to work, to include all of these externalities. So suggestion one, reduce meat consumption. Suggestion two, trade policy, including water footprinting into all of this discussion. And then you can have appropriate trade and then appropriate production and so on.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. We'll take 2 rows behind on the left side. On here. Or you can, there's one, yeah. Sorry. On your right side, Ida.
Thank you. I'm an urbanist, a landscape architect in California, but from Latin America. I want to ask about cap and trade. It seems like we haven't, I don't think I've heard the word mentioned, and it's a very popular conversation, certainly in America and then in Canada. And I want to pose, because I'm very interested in vertical thinking and sort of breaking down the silos, and especially green infrastructure. And when we talk about cap and trade, it seems like we're focused mostly on air, and obviously air, all the infrastructures actually should come together. And I'm afraid that, and want to pose the question about, is green infrastructure a license to pollute at levels that we should be very cognizant and aware of?
So any comments about the footprint and the need for trade policies and water issues or green infrastructure?
I can try again. Yes, water footprinting analysis has progressed quite a little bit, and in this report on options for decoupling, economic growth from water pollution and water use produced by UNEP last year, did dwell on that quite a lot. And you are very spot on. The fact is that we do not internalize all the externalities of our actions, and that is why we have market failures in the systems. And where you have those market failures, you always get free riders that will continue to pollute, and that's the problem. We have that in water, we have that in climate change, we have that in CO2 emission, we have that across board, simply because sometimes trade agreements are not that simple. The geopolitics of it and the political economy of trade in itself is a very difficult thing to navigate, and may not be something that I can address fully here. But you're right, we need to actually make sure that we get the full value chain and understand what's going on, and also how products are actually carrying the water around, and embed that in how we make our trade policies. But this is a recommendation that could go to WTO in their discussions, so that the experts and the diplomats who negotiate that can take that forward. The other question was on
green infrastructure.
On the cap and trade.
On green infrastructure. You're absolutely right. That's very important. And again, there are complex issues that needs to be handled in it. Maybe I wouldn't want to get into that here.
Well, you know, in the U.S. we and in the Michigan and the Great Lakes Basin, where we have a lot of water, agriculture was exempt from much of the rules around water. They were reporting. They finally had a rule that passed that said you had to report how much groundwater you were using in agriculture. And they're using more now because of climate change. It was a rain-fed, agriculture originally. But they use it for free. And so one of the things, if we don't start to think about the one water approach and bring water management on food and management of water for food closer together, both in terms of monitoring quantity and efficiency, those types of things. And I think we need to have all that data first before we're going to make adequate policies at the global level in terms of trade. And so we've got to start at some of these levels, and the agricultural community in some areas are very, of course, resistant. And we haven't done a good job with groundwater. And groundwater is a very significant source of the green, piece of the virtual water. So we're going to have to do more on the science piece and start connecting that. The green infrastructure, and it was back when you were talking about compliance, somebody talked about the compliance issue, and I think you mentioned it as well. And this is for stormwater and non-point source pollution because of that. If we don't have enough compliance, I'd like the idea of the statistics we heard about Stockholm, this 30% green and bringing more of it green and tying it into your drainage systems and keeping the water on the land. And we know that landscape architecture is thinking about these things. We want more of that. How much more do we need? Do we need 30% of the land? Should we be trying to achieve 40% in our landscape? And where should we go? And can we learn from places like Stockholm or Philadelphia, which has made a big effort, you may know, in that arena? And so, and then going back to how much that saves us and in terms of stormwater impacts and other things. So I think it is complicated to get it up to that, to the level of a global policy. Yeah. But this compliance issue, keeping things simple, when more people can comply, the data says that's better than trying to keep something very complicated that only a few people can comply. And so now we're starting to be able to put that into practice.
Yeah. I can't resist entering the climate change dimension into discussion. Dr. Rose mentioned it now. I have two examples. 3 years ago, I was following the enormous flooding in Pakistan, and you may discuss whether floods and hurricanes, the way they are now, whether they are also related to climate change. Right. But it happened, and I remember a cable coming in to me in New York from a colleague who was talking about the enormous problems on water in Pakistan, and he said, paradoxically in his cable, too much water, but not a drop to drink, because all the freshwater sources have been destroyed by this enormous flood, which was almost the size of Sweden. We are a pretty big country. But the other thing I want to say is a visit that I made only 3 months ago to Vietnam. I was in the Mekong Delta, and I've been sort of talking publicly about climate change, and rising sea levels would have an effect in 40, 50 years. It has an effect now. The rising sea levels are causing enormous problems for the Mekong Delta First of all, the level of the deltas, the water has gone down because of dams being built around Vietnam. But secondly, now with the waves from the sea, the cyclones and so forth, the salt water is now entering the freshwater sources. So the fishing is more or less destroyed, normal fishing, traditional fishing, but also the salt water is now penetrating the rather porous land, so it is now affecting also groundwater. I saw at the coastline 20 meters of land being lost in the last 10 years. I was convinced because people really showed me exactly how much land had disappeared. And that water is now entering the groundwater. So here we have people now leaving their farms because the salt water destroys the rice harvest. Cattle is sick and dying, and the farms cannot sustain life. So the children goes to the cities, and the area is slowly being depopulated. Slowly, I must say. But here is an area of 18 million people. It's not 200,000 people in the Maldives or Marshall Islands. Same thing is happening probably around, I haven't seen but I'm sure it's happening in Bangladesh and Myanmar and India also. So here we have this factor we need to come in to also, the climate change factor, which goes back and is so strongly related to the freshwater challenge we have.
I'd like to add to that because we're finding with climate change that it's affecting diseases as well. We've been able to show that over the last 50 years that the sea temperature has risen about 1.5 degrees. And in the North Sea area, the bacteria that are naturally occurring, of which cholera-causing bacterium is one, the numbers have been going up by looking at the plankton that's been stored from 50 years ago to the present. And this has correlated with the increase in infections caused by those bacteria. So we already have evidence of a human health problem directly associated with climate change.
Interesting.
I think we've talked a lot, I think, in previous World Water Weeks about climate change being really water change and how we can interact more with the climate change discussions. And I think we've made little baby steps within the discussions. And I think it's now, as we've talked about, I think maybe it's also time to include that in the trade negotiations as well. I'll take one more. There was a gentleman there in the middle, and then in front here.
Hello, my name is Edward Ravine. I'm a student in the United States where I study economics and political science. And then this summer I've had the pleasure to work here at Civi, organizing World Water Week. And today we've been discussing water pricing a lot. And then I'm curious, there's two ways to go about it. One is to charge the companies for polluting. And another way would be to pay them for polluting less. And I'm curious what method you guys prefer and what are the pros and cons between these two. Thank
Simple
you.
questions. You have to think about that until we go here. I'm making Ida work hard.
Hello, I'm Barbara Frost from WaterAid. I found it an absolutely fascinating panel discussion, so stimulating. And I'd like to ask your advice, because as an NGO which has got a focus on the poorest people, the most marginalised people, and access to safe water to drink, to decent hygiene and sanitation, we've been puzzling about how best to influence change and whether we should be talking to the water and sanitation professions, whether we should be talking to the health, the economists, in terms of influencing work, while at the same time, of course, we will continue to work investing in partners at local level to bring services to people and to raise awareness about the health impacts of poor hygiene. But I'd really like to hear from the panel, if you were in our shoes, Cecilia and I, running WaterAid, where should we put our efforts?
So let's start with the water pricing. So the polluter pays, or the government pays them to pollute less.
I think the basic principles would suggest that the polluter should pay. Reason being, when you introduce a negative externality in a system, you are gaining some positive utility from doing that. And in order to compensate for that, then you need to pay for it. So polluter pays principle will drive behavioral change more than a polluter gets principle, which you are trying to propose. Because if the government subsidizes, because that would be an effective subsidy, and if the government subsidizes pollution, it will encourage pollution. Yeah. As we have seen, subsidies normally distort markets. So I would not go for subsidizing pollution. So that would be, but this is more straight economics without thinking of the politics and also the social dimensions of it in doing that. But I would like to suggest that that happens. But where water pricing becomes a little bit trickier is actually water pricing for drinking water for the rural poor. And this is where, in my speech, I mentioned South Africa, who has a graduated water pricing system and a system that actually makes sure that the poor will still get water because water is a human right. So in that case, that is where the government can come in order to ensure that there are different ways of doing it. In different models, you get those who can afford it pay more than the value so that there is a redistribution within the system to ensure that the poorer people also get more. But they will still have to pay something because without paying something, they will use it as a jiffin good, which doesn't work. So it's a very complex discussion, but adopting that principle of pricing is known to change behavior. But how you do the pricing will depend on the context within which you are operating and also the ability to pay the prices that you give. So it's a very long discussion I can have with you as economists later.
Yeah. But you know, I think the incentives, some of the incentives are around the technology for resource recovery. So it's sort of like in some states they put, you know, incentives around recycling glass, recycling plastics, or even in some communities. And so you see that happening because there's a resource there and eventually it becomes valuable. So there can be some incentives around technologies for certain industries, wastewater industries, that might say, oh, okay, you can have resource recovery, and as a matter of fact, that prevents pollution. In the wastewater business, water now is becoming a valuable, you know, commodity, and so you could incentivize that. But we use lawsuits a lot in the United States as the for the polluter pays, you know. So we do have both approaches.
I'd like to just come in on this in that I would agree that it is about the polluter paying, but in itself, it's not a solution when you've got a lot of small-scale manufacturers. And I have seen projects where there's a cluster of small-scale manufacturers. This is down in the south, Tirupur textile industry, total mess in terms of the water bodies, so much so that the High Court of India came in and asked for these to be shut down. So overnight, we had 300,000 people go without jobs. So really forcing a solution. But that solution could not lie readily in terms of the polluters paying, because now, A, they had shut plants, and B, they were very small. So I think the remedy can't be a subsidy, because I agree that that distorts. But one-time solutions which caused some capital cost to come in a manner which enabled all the small-scale companies to reopen at a different level of effluent control. So I think there are models which we have to create, which are sensible, which bridge this gap which does exist. And we have to be sensitive to the small-scale producers' needs as well, and not always solve for the big cost. And on water price, I mean, I can tell you in India, the poor person today pays more for water than the rich. And when you begin to look at the price, it's exorbitant, because they recognize the need for clean water and they will buy it, and sometimes they have to pay for water because they don't have water supply. So what is that price of water is a very difficult human answer, but I think the answer lies exactly as South Africa has, that you have a basic need that is met for free, and then it ratchets up based on use. And you know, if you're absorbing If you're a big user because you want water for your garden, well, you pay multiples of what someone else might. Yeah.
So turning to the question of mentoring tips for water aid, I think feeling that we're taking...
I'll try to
But
answer
she's
that.
my mentor, so...
where do we put our efforts to influence to make sure that everyone everywhere has access to safe water and sanitation?
Since I have a past in water aid, I'd like to address Barbara's question. I think you're doing a good job already, but if I were to spontaneously think of categories that you could think about, I would say to use in today's world the social media and getting to young people and to raise the awareness of the need to do this, but also the good examples and the yes we can attitude that I think we need to have on this, because there's so much of resignation and hopelessness around that today we have to mobilize around something which is hands-on concrete, and you have a great message to send. So I would say use the new social media, reach young people. I would also say, since I believe very much in democratic institutions, that we need to strengthen their hand, and I think if parliaments would take more seriously this issue and also make it a political issue, I think it would be a great step forward also in increasing the standing of our democratic institutions, which is important in today's world. And the last one is an advice to reach the finance ministers. I think the most successful meeting that I ever attended on water was when the World Bank and UN together organized a meeting, and I think Sustainable Water for All was introduced at that meeting, remember? I think 2012. And that was with 47 ministers of finance from all over the world, not least many in Africa. And it turned out that 2 years later we made a survey whether there had been any changes in the budgets of sanitation. And it turns out of the 47, 13 had given sanitation higher priority in their own budgets. So social media, the parliaments and finance ministers would be my suggestion.
Rita?
I think the discussion this morning has really emphasized that this is an interdisciplinary problem, and there's an important role for the social behavioral scientists. And I think a message to us scientists, the natural scientists, is that, in fact, without the economists and the social behavioral scientists, the sociologists understanding human behavior, we really don't make any changes. And so I think bringing together, in the case of water, not just the hydrographers or just the public health experts, but a team along with the behavioral experts, I think that is really the message in this 21st century.
Sorry, after you go.
Okay, and you've just taken words out of my mouth in terms of, just to repeat what I was saying when the Water Framework Directive was being shaped in the 2000s, don't forget the social scientists, because in social change, they actually come in very strongly. And in doing that, when you go to countries, don't just go to the water ministries or environment ministries. Let your first port of call be the people who have the pulse, the finance ministers. If we are able to bring them together with the water ministries and the environment ministries and so on, change happens faster. And we've seen that in the work of the Africa Development Bank on improving the quality of lives for Africans. And then the president at the Senate insists that if it's agriculture, the agriculture minister must coalesce and bring other ministries together for meetings to happen. So we've had such great meetings on agriculture, on energy, and so on. And what you find is that the country owns it. And then when they're doing their budget processes, suddenly agriculture is on the table. And the agriculture minister is not fighting for the money, but actually it becomes an economic issue in terms of we know clearly the implications for growth in these countries. The same for water, the same for energy. And the energy we've gotten in terms of political support from the countries, just by adopting that cross-disciplinary, cross-ministerial approach is very critical. And because someone has mentioned climate change, and we have COP22 coming forward, water issue has not been reflected enough in the climate dialogues, and water is very central. It's actually one of the victims of climate change and also one of the medium for impacts of climate change. Whether it's in energy, sea level rise, we've heard the implications. When you have less water, hydropower stations will shut down and desertification will occur more and droughts will kill more people. So all these are, water is a connector. And I think it would be useful if out of this meeting there is some kind of a communique coming through to COP22 to try to make that more central. In SDGs, that's one goal, but for me, all the 17 goals are actually dependent on water. And that needs also to come out a little bit more so that we'll drive this interdisciplinary, interministerial joint effort on what seems to be one of the major issues of the continent.
And that cues well in, because time is soon running out. And I want to give you all a chance. We've talked a lot about the Sustainable Development Goals, obviously, during the week, and especially, I think, in the plenary, in the opening, we were really talking about how now it's time for implementation. Last year was really the goal setting, and we've come far, and we were happy with the goals that we set, but how do we now implement it? So I want to give all of the panelists a few minutes to, or maybe 1 minute. You're going to see they're going to stick to it strictly now. 1 minute to just, from your perspective, in order for us to 2030, when we stand here in front of the world and are actually accountable, each and every one of us, for have we achieved what we set out in 2015? What is it that needs to happen? And what do we all in this room need to go out and do from your perspective? Joan, I'm going to ask you first.
Yeah, so I'm a big supporter that knowledge helps promote change and empowers people to make better decisions. And talking about the new IT or the media that we have, one of the things that came out is that the data we were putting together for the Global Water Pathogens Project had to be visible on a phone and so how do you create the tables and the apps so that they can access the information? And in Tanzania, 80% of the people access the website with their phone. And so we have to talk to the IT people about how do we create a pathway to knowledge. The other thing is case studies, putting case studies up there and pilot systems. I think these case studies and pilot plants, I think we don't build enough of them around to showcase different solutions. And we need those all over the world. And you can gain access to them from anywhere in the world if we connect through the internet. So that's my message is to try to gain access to the knowledge, usable knowledge, and build concrete case studies and pilot systems.
Thank you. So,
I think it's really critical that we understand very accurately, very completely, exactly the biological components of water. We've been able to measure the chemical components to 7 decimal places, but yet we're continuing to allow ourselves not even to understand anything about 20 or 25 of pathogens that are transmitted by water. If we understood that, I think we would better be able to protect ourselves and prevent diseases transmitted by water, and would put our efforts into providing safe water and good sanitation, clearly the needs of the 21st century.
For me, I would like to see by 2030 that 5 things would have been done. One, that countries, both at the global and local levels, have put in right policies to prevent pollution and also penalize excessive use of water. So that way we can get behavioral change to lead to water for sustainability. I would also like to see that countries and companies, both public and private sectors, would have invested enough in these simple technologies that we've seen, technologies and innovations that will help us to do more with water, achieve more with water, in order to be able to basically get more prosperity with less pollution impacts and less impact on quantity of water available for all. I would also like to see that there is a green water initiative for Africa where we as a global community are helping the continent that holds 65% of arable land to do better with water and be able to grow crops and grow our food better to feed the billions of people we're expecting to see. I would also like to see education happen, a better science. I want to see more people like these in Africa that can understand the water systems of the continent and help carry the message, the great work that are doing other places. And finally, I would like to see quality water for all.
That's what the goal is, no? So that's what we have to aim for.
Thank you.
Access to everyone everywhere. Nina.
So I'd certainly like us to work to a price for water. For too long, the political process has skirted this. And I just don't see how the economics of water works unless we can price it right. So pricing it right, pricing it fairly, pricing it in an inclusive way, but pricing it. I think the second I'd like to see is much more not-for-profit NGO activity in these spaces. There are really very few players like WaterAid, and I wasn't kidding when I said, you know, people like WaterAid mentor many of us to understand the issues on the ground. And through large NGOs or larger NGOs like WaterAid, a bunch of other flowers bloom because they work through local NGOs. So the disciplines of how to work get better instilled. And we need more of this. And we as a community have to support this activity much more. There are far more NGOs in spaces like education and children and women, you know, specific silos, all of which get impacted by water, but they don't look at water, and therefore it remains an underfunded area to my mind. And we need these partners, because no community activity is going to happen without the partnership of the not-for-profit space. So more of that. And I would just add my voice to the whole area of education, but to the education, add again this not siloing, but twinning. And I think Professor Rose referred to it, that the water technologist should also get finance and business as part of that knowledge, because if he or she goes beyond the science to being an innovator or a startup engineer, then the disciplines of how to commercialize that are equally valuable, because the innovation frameworks, while they exist in Silicon Valley, they don't exist enough in the spaces we need, like provision of drinking water, water ATMs, sanitation, distributed sanitation. So the models for delivery where entrepreneurs can make money, the for-profit model, is very tough to fund today vis-a-vis the not-for-profit model. Because not-for-profit gets the development money, but just because you're for-profit doesn't make you bad, because you're actually filling a very important gap. And we need to find those solutions as well, the venture capital angel funding that would provide that.
So last but not least, Deputy Secretary of the UN, these are your goals.
Conclusions, I subscribe to the eminent member of this panel. Very glad to be on this panel. By the way, it has a pretty good gender balance, doesn't it? That's the way we should see it around the world. But I can't refrain from just adding one dimension that I will spell out tomorrow at the opening of the World Water Week, the high segment tomorrow. And that is the role of water for maintaining peace. This is a very serious issue. I talked to Therese Schenander, who met me here, who works with this. We talked about the importance of water diplomacy, what I would call hydro diplomacy. I wrote an article in Nature about that a year ago. That I've seen now growingly that water becoming a scarce resource could then be very much a reason for conflict. We see it in the transboundary river situations where one country wants energy, another one wants to maintain their agriculture, and there is a contradiction, they say, although it shouldn't, but that's the case it is. We have at least 2 or 3 very serious such situations around the world. I was mediating in the war in Darfur, and I saw the most shocking things, like a militia throwing dead dogs in the wells in the villages in Jebel Mara in northern Darfur in order to chase the population away into the camps. Well, I said to myself, what joy do they have of doing that? Because nobody could take over that village. You couldn't continue life there. People had to leave because they used water as a method of warfare. And a big challenge to many of you, particularly young people in the academic world, is to develop models of cooperation. If we move now into a historic stage where we may see scarce resources for many reasons, we have to be much more active in developing methods of cooperation, that sharing is going to be the best long-term solution for everybody involved, and that it could be a great confidence-building measure in intense situations. If, for instance, freshwater was to be fairly shared on the West Bank between Palestinians and Israelis, you would have a huge contribution to confidence building, which would reach right into the level of families. I can give many other examples of this, and this is the challenge that I think we should retain. And by this, maybe you can listen to my speech tomorrow.
A cliffhanger for tomorrow's session. That's always good. Well, thank you very much to the panel. Thank you very much for all the audience that have been here. I mean, I do think this is the era of really do. And I'm going to steal from you, Professor Rama. So I think my motto for the next 14 years are really going to be, yes, we can, it's solvable, go out and make it happen. And with that, I want to give us all that challenge, and thank you very much. And thank you, Your Majesty, for taking the time to be with us today. And yeah, thanks a lot. I'll let Your Majesty lead the way for lunch. And please, if everyone can please rise. Thank you very much.